Hi, hello. I'm going to go through some annotations of an inspector calls. I'm going to start from page 167. I'm going to be looking at gender and the patriarchy, the character of Mr. Burling, just to consolidate what we've learnt over the last few weeks, the entrance of the inspector, and just a quick bit about Sheila, which is what the focus of the next lesson is on. Okay. So for this you're going to need your copy of the text and some fancy highlighting equipment. I've got some highlighters and some pens, a pencil and a ruler, just to keep things nice and neat. Now, as usual, I'd encourage you to annotate in pencil, just to keep things nice and tidy so you can get rid of them and add to your notes as you move through year 11. Okay, so I'm going to start by just going back and just going over some of the information, hopefully, that you've learned about Mr. Birling so far. We've learned that he's an obstinate man. He is an older gentleman who really represents the type of people that Priestley was against. He was against these the middle to upper classes who worked the working classes really, really hard and sat back and took all the money from it, and that was called capitalism. And Priestley is very much against capitalism, and Burling in this text is a construct. He's a construct. He represents those who have capitalist ideals in society. So we know that Burling is pretty much a bad character. We're not supposed to like him. We're supposed to find him a little ridiculous, and we're going to start just by looking at some of the quotes in the text that we've already looked at so far. We looked before at the way he talks about the Titanic. He refers to it as unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. I think I'm just going to highlight these in yellow. So he talks about the Titanic as being unsinkable. Look back at your annotations from last lesson. I'm not going to annotate this. I want you to do that using your notes from the last two lessons. He also talks about these Bernard Shaws and H.G. Wells's do all the talking. They were famous science fiction fantasy writers and had a vision of the future which he didn't agree with. Also, he talks about the labour agitations and all these silly little war scares. And just a reminder that this play is set in 1912, just before the First World War, but was written in 1945, so just after the Second World War, a time where the world really was changing. And he uses this story set in the past to point out everything that was wrong with society, and that really stems from this movement towards a Labour government, the construction of the NHS, and all the positive socialist ideals that Priestley wanted to really back and support. He also talks here about getting onto the honours list. He says, I might find my way into the next honours list, just a knighthood, of course. And that's really where I'm going to start from today. I'm going to read the text and I'm going to annotate it just like I would do in class. Hopefully find this helpful and easy to follow, and we can then move on to how we would write about Burling in next week's lessons. Okay. Now he says he's talking to Gerald here, and he says, I might find my way onto the honours list, just a knighthood, of course. That's obviously getting knighted by the Queen for being a fantastic capitalist. And Gerald says, oh, I say, congratulations. Burling, thanks, but it's a bit too early for that, so don't say anything. But I've had a hint or two. You see, I was Lord Mayor here 2 years ago when royalty visited us, and I've always been regarded as a sound, useful party man. So, well, I gather there's a very good chance of a knighthood, as long as we behave ourselves and don't get into the police court or start a scandal, eh? Laughs complacently. I think this is a fascinating quote, because it's really this admission before, if you've read a little bit further, hopefully you have by now, into the text, you'll know that they are about to get into a very big scandal. So this bit here is a good example of dramatic irony. We know that there is going to be an inspector arriving and could well be the focus of the family for this scandal in particular. So I'm just going to annotate here this dramatic irony. And this is a very ironic statement, isn't it? Because we know that they haven't behaved themselves. We know that by the end of the play in particular. And this kind of arrogance here to say that he was going to be knighted by the Queen, despite the despicable behaviour that the Burlings and Crofts have been involved in, shows the kind of mindset that Burling has. He also laughs complacently. Now, if you don't know what complacently means, just go and look it up. But basically, it means without taking it seriously. So he doesn't feel like he's under threat. So here he's very relaxed and feels as if nothing really is going to go wrong, and the only thing that can is going to help is this family moving forward. Okay, Gerald, you seem to be a nice, well-behaved family. We think we are. So if that's the only obstacle, sir, I think you might as well accept my congratulations now. No, I couldn't do that, and don't say anything yet. Not even to my mother? I know she'd be delighted. Well, when she comes back, you might drop a hint to her, and you can promise her that we'll try to keep out of trouble during the next few months. They both laugh, and Eric enters. So just to remind you that Gerald is not a Burling, Gerald is a Croft, but he will soon be marrying a Burling. He's going to be marrying Sheila, who's not in the scene at the moment. But the other Burling, the other son, Eric, enters, who we've looked at before, has a bit of a drinking problem, and is not taken very seriously by his father, and has a lot of issues and problems. Yeah, I'm in school. Eric, what's the joke? Started telling stories? No. Want another glass of port? Eric, sitting down. Yes, please. Takes decanter and helps himself. Mother says we mustn't stay too long, but I don't think it matters. I left 'em talking about clothes again. You think a girl never had any clothes before she gets married? Women are potty about them. Yes, but you've got to remember, my boy, that clothes mean something quite different to a woman. Not just something to wear, and not only something to make 'em look prettier, but, well, a sort of sign of or token of their self-respect. That's true. Eric eagerly. Yes, I remember. But he checks himself. Well, what do you remember? Nothing. Nothing? Gerald, amused. Sounds a bit fishy to me. Okay, I'm going to pause there. So really what you see here is everything that's wrong with the Burlings and also with the patriarchy. You might remember from last week's lessons I taught you about what the patriarchy means. So if you're unsure, go back and have a look at some of those resources there to help you to understand it. It is ultimately a society governed by men. So I'm just going to make a note here. This is a really patriarchal conversation where they're talking in quite the meaning way about women and not taking them very seriously. Let's pick out a few of those quotes. You'd think a girl, just here, you'd think a girl never had any clothes before she gets married. Women are potty about them. Now that's Eric, the son of Burling, and then Burling reaffirms that and he says, my clothes mean something different to a woman. Not just something to wear, not only something to make them look prettier, but, well, a sort of sign of token of their self-respect. This is Burling being extremely, extremely offensive to a modern day audience. He's talking here in quite patronising tones about his opinion and his perspective on gender. He talks here about clothes making women feel better about themselves, a sign of token of their self-respect. That clothes are the only thing that kind of make women feel better. Now, just as a reminder, this was this was written at a time just after the Second World War, and this is when I'm going to put some notes up here. This is set in a time where women now occupied most of the male jobs after the Second World War. A newfound independence. Obviously, most men had gone to go and fight in the Second World War, and women therefore took a really important role in the responsibilities that sorry, I just moved that down. Didn't have one of you to tell me that it was off the screen. This was set at a time where women had taken most of the job roles, and it had changed kind of perception of female empowerment and what women were capable of doing, and this led towards the women's suffragette movement, which Priestley was a really big advocate of. He supported independence for women to vote and to have power. At this point, women really are seen as a much more inferior gender, as we see in Eva Smith later on in the play, and also Edna, but also the treatment of Sheila and how Sheila's kind of knocked back and quite babyish. This is also demonstrates how Burling's views about women, that women only care about clothes, are also passed down to his son, and this is really important. We can see here that what Burling is making Eric who he is. And kind of really shows us that through the generations, these perspectives, these moral values were passed down from generation to generation. And that is a problem that Priestley and the inspector, who is basically Priestley, are hoping to break down. Okay. Right, I'm going to move on now to look at Mr. Burling in just a little bit more detail. We have looked at him over the last few weeks in the lesson, so please go back, complete those lessons if you haven't done so already. Okay. Taking up in the same manner. So Burling kind of takes this and changes the subject to a point, and he talks about men and the role of men, and you should be familiar with this section of text because we have looked at it. Yes, we don't know what some of these boys get up to nowadays. More money to spend and time to spare than when I was at Eric's age. They worked us hard in those days and kept us short of cash, though even then we broke out and had a bit of fun sometimes. Gerald: I bet you did. Burling solemnly: but this is the point. I don't want to lecture you two young fellows again, but what so many of you don't seem to understand, when things are so much easier, is that a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself, and his family too, of course, when he has one, and so long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. I'm just going to pause there. I'm just going to point out some of the things that Burling is talking about here. He says a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself and his family too. And that's that idea that Burling is trying to point out, that these people, the middle classes, were isolated. They were selfish and uncaring. And that was a big problem, and Burling all the way through, he's a hard-headed businessman. He wants to look after himself and protect his own fortune and business and reputation. It's all about him, it's all about them. They don't think about the working class, they don't think about anybody else. But the way some of these cranks talk and write now, you think everyone has to look after everyone else, as if we're all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. But take my word for it, you youngsters, and I've learnt in the good hard school of experience that a man has to mind his own business and to look after himself and his own. And we hear the sharp ring of a front doorbell. Burling stops to listen. Okay, really powerful interruption there. I wonder if you can work out who that is, perhaps calling at the door. So we've looked at these quotes over the last couple of weeks. He talks here about the way these cranks talk, but the way some of these cranks talk, and right now you think everybody had to look after everybody else, as if we're all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. And what he's talking about there is he's talking about rising socialism. He's talking about some politicians are spreading the word that we should look after one another. We looked, hopefully you've looked especially at this quote here, like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. Now we annotated it last week, this quote. Hopefully you've got this now, that this is a simile here, like bees in a hive. And he talks about community and all that nonsense. So really what he's saying here is that, this is ridiculous. You shouldn't have to look after everybody else. Just look after yourself. Don't worry about anybody else. The irony there, and it kind of points out the stupidity in some ways of Burling. He's not actually stupid. He's a very intelligent man, but that he is so ignorant to ignore the fact that bees are actually very successful animals. They work together. They all work together to produce a successful society and create what is honey and a way of keeping their hive alive. But he talks down here about he learnt in the good hard school of experience. He's talking here about his background and where he comes from. A man has to mind his own business and look after himself, and he's quite literally interrupted there. He's interrupted by this front doorbell. He's stopped in what he's saying. All of these quite offensive page of information spoken by Mr. Burling. He is interrupted, as he is many times over the next few pages. But this doorbell signals the entrance that something is about to change. Somebody at the front door. Edna will answer it. Well, have another glass of port, Gerald, and then we'll join the ladies. That'll stop me giving the good advice. Yes, you piled it on a bit tonight, Father. Special occasion. I'm feeling contented. For once, I wanted you to have the benefit of my experience. Edna enters. Please, sir, an inspector's called. An inspector? What kind of inspector? A police inspector. He says his name's Inspector Gould. Don't know him. Does he want to see me? Yes, sir. He says it's important. All right, Edna. Show him in here. Give us some more light. Edna does, then goes out. I'm still on the bench. It may be something about a warrant. Gerald lightly. Sure to be, unless Eric's been up to something. Nodding confidentially to Birling. That would be awkward, wouldn't it? Humorously. Very. Eric, who is uneasy, sharply. Here, what do you mean? Gerald lightly. Only something we were talking about when you were out. A joke, really. Eric, still uneasy. Well, I don't find it's very funny. Okay, so just before this, we see here that Eric is kind of made fun of by Gerald and Burling, and actually Gerald is more similar to Burling than his actual son is. I'm going to write that he is the butt of the jokes. And shows kind of how he's not really respected by Burling. We'll come back to those ideas another time. Okay, so I'm going to look now at the entrance of the inspector, which is the third point that I showed you at the beginning. So before we actually hear the inspector speak, we have another set of stage directions. And this is really important because, as we've learned over the last couple of weeks, Priestley guides the director in how each of these characters should be played. So he's saying this is what he should look like and this is how he should behave, and they're very explicit directions that tell the director exactly the way that it should be done, and it's important because of who the inspector is. The inspector enters, and he need not be a big man, but he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. He is a man in his 50s, dressed in a plain, darkish suit of the period. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. So you can imagine the character, the actor playing this role of the inspector would need to have a real air of authority, and it shows that the inspector has authority on the stage, so much so that he is described as massive, i.e. big in size, his solidity and purposefulness. And this rule of 3 here shows that he is important, he is incorruptible, and he is determined. He also, even the way that he speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of staring at people when he talks. He's quite intimidating. I'm just going to put adverbs here, because these words here, carefully and weightily. And this word weightily, I think, is one of the most important there. He talks there about his when he speaks, his words have a weight to them. That what he's saying is important or significant. Okay. Mr. Burling. Yes, sit down, Inspector. Inspector sitting. Thank you, sir. Have a glass of port or a little whiskey. No, thank you, Mr. Birling. I'm on duty. Now, this again links back to this idea that he is solid and he has purposefulness. These ideas here are linked because he's saying straight away, I don't drink when I work. I take my job seriously. Bearing in mind that he's entered this scene where everybody else has been celebrating, he really does change the tone of this scene from being a all by awkward family family meeting, family celebration, but he is definitely much more serious than the rest of them. You're new, aren't you? Yes, sir. Only recently transferred. I thought you must be. I was an alderman for years and Lord Mayor 2 years ago. And I'm still on the bench, so I know the Brumley police officers pretty well, and I thought I'd never seen you before. Quite so. What you see over the next couple of pages is the Mr. Burling flexing his authority. He's saying, as we've seen on the previous pages, that he's an important man. And he's not somebody to be messed with, somebody to be taken lightly. And he's kind of, in a passive-aggressive way, he's threatening the inspector and saying, just to let you know, I'm very important. Well, what can I do for you? Some trouble about a warrant? No, Mr. Burling. After a pause, with a touch of impatience. Well, what is it then? I'd like some information, if you don't mind, Mr. Burling. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. That's like the hospital. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course. My God! Eric. Inspector, yes, she was in great agony. They did everything they could for her at the infirmary, but she died. Suicide, of course. Burling rather impatiently. Yes, the horrible business, but I don't understand why you should come here, Inspector, cutting through massively. And just look out for these incredible stage directions that really kind of give us an idea who has the power in these conversations, cutting through massively, linking back to what we were talking about over here, of about his massive presence that he has in the room, and the way in which he talks. It's heavy. Nobody can interrupt him. He cuts people off, and he does it several times over the next couple of pages. I've been round to the room. She had, and she'd left a letter there, and sort of a diary. Like a lot of these young women who get in various kinds of trouble, she'd used more than one name, but her original name, her real name, was Eva Smith. Thoughtfully, Burling. Eva Smith? Do you remember her, Mr. Burling? Burling slowly. No, I seem to remember hearing that name, Eva Smith, somewhere, but it doesn't convey anything to me, and I don't see where I come into this. She was employed in your works at one time. Oh, that's it, is it? Well, we've several hundred young women there, you know, and they keep changing. This young woman, Eva Smith, was a bit out of the ordinary. I found a photograph of her in her lodgings. Perhaps you'd remember her from that. The inspector takes a photograph, about postcard size, out of his pocket and goes to Burling. Both Gerald and Eric rise to have a look at the photograph, but the inspector interposes himself between them and the photograph. That means he kind of blocks, so he blocks Eric and Gerald, and that's significant for what happens a bit later on. So only Burling sees the photograph. They are surprised and rather annoyed. Burling stares hard and with recognition at the photograph, which the inspector then replaces in his pocket. Gerald showing annoyance. Any particular reason why I shouldn't see this girl's photograph, Inspector? Inspector coolly, looking hard at him. There might be. And the same applies to me, I suppose. Yes. I can't imagine what it could be. Neither can I. And I must say, I agree with them, Inspector. Okay, so immediately the first reaction is defense, is absolute defensiveness. He's saying, you know, it's nothing to do with any of us. Why are you here, almost? Who is this man who is not showing us the photo? Very frustrating. It's the way I like to work. One person and one line of inquiry at a time. Otherwise, there's a muddle. I see. Sensible, really. Moves restlessly, then turns. You've had enough of that port, Eric. The inspector is watching Burling, and now Burling notices him. I think you remember Eva Smith now, don't you, Mr. Burling? Yes, I do. She was one of my employees, and then I discharged her. Is that why you committed suicide? When was this, Father? Just keep quiet, Eric, and don't get excited. This girl left us nearly 2 years ago. Let me see, it must have been in the early autumn of 1910. Yes, end of September 1910. That's right. Okay, he talks here about the family knowing and the Crofts being involved in it, and that Gerald is going to marry Sheila. And at the bottom, Burling says here, look, there's nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business, at least not so far as I'm concerned. It's a perfectly straightforward case, as it happened more than 18 months ago, nearly 2 years ago. Obviously, it has nothing whatever to do with the wretched girl's suicide, eh, Inspector? And this really is kind of what tells us a lot about Burling and the character of Burling and Mrs. Burling, surely, is the fact that they immediately do not care about the death of this poor young woman who, you may have noticed that I highlighted over here with this description. I think this is quite a graphic description of this woman, the death of this girl. It burnt her inside out. She drank bleach and it killed her in great agony. Now bear in mind this kind of emotional, graphic description, and then compare it with the way that Burling talks about it. He talks about it as a business, and that is really what Priestley is getting at. He's getting at this idea of this capitalist ideal where people don't care about the treatment of others, and particularly in this case the death of Eva Smith. He talks about it as a business, and it's this lack of emotion which Priestley is critical of in the first place. He talks about her as a wretched girl's suicide. Quite harsh way of describing the suicide of a young woman, and shows that he is emotionless and quite removed from the terrible going on here. As we work down, we learn that Burling, she worked for Burling, and Burling, she basically stood up and said, "You need to pay us women more. We deserve more money." He said that she was a good worker, and she stood up and said, "We deserve a pay rise." And it was actually quite a small pay rise that they were requesting, and as a result, Burling wants to keep his labour costs down, and he tells her to go and work somewhere else. So he fires her, he sacks her, and Eric's reaction is, he says, you could have kept her on instead of throwing her out. I call it tough luck, and that shows us that there is hope. There is hope for Eric here and the younger generations. We'll come back to that here in the future, and come back to these ideas where Eric's initial reactions is one of sympathy and empathy, whereas Burling is the opposite. And he says here, "Rubbish! If you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth." And it really points out everything that is wrong with Mr. Burling. Okay, I'm going to skip forward a little bit with the entrance of Sheila, which I've totally noted down somewhere. Okay, Sheila enters, and please read Act 1 for yourself. I will come back and I will look at some more details, the pages that I've just skipped, but today I'm just focusing on just the reaction to the death of Eva Smith. So Sheila's reaction is one of slow recognition, and we realise that as the inspector tells us a little bit more about Eva Smith, Sheila also has a part to play. I'm just going to read, just from here. And Burling realises that they haven't just come to see, the inspector hasn't just come to see him, it's also his children. He says, "Well, of course, if I'd known that earlier, I would have called you officious and talked about reporting you. You understand that, don't you, Inspector? I thought that, for some reason, best known to yourself, you were making the most of this tiny bit of information I could give you. I'm sorry. This makes a difference. You're sure of your facts?" "Some of them, yes. I can't think they can be of any great consequence. The girl's dead, though." "What do you mean by saying that? You talk as if we were responsible." And this is Sheila here, in the same way as Eric, starting to recognise that they may have a part to play in this. That Sheila starts to kind of even cut in on her father's, the man that she called Daddy, and she calls her mum Mummy. She's kind of starting to take a little tiny glimpse of responsibility, because Sheila starts to interrupt here. So Sheila cutting in, "Why should you? He's finished with you. He says it's one of us now." And as we work down, we look at the way in which Sheila responds to this personal story of Eva Smith, and how she was fired from the factory, and her life went downhill because of that. I think it was a mean thing to do. Perhaps that spoilt everything for her. And Sheila over here talks here about, "I think so, it's a rotten shame." And the inspector says, "There are a lot of young women living that sort of existence in every town and every city and big town in this country, Miss Burling. If there weren't, the factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour. Ask your father." "But these girls aren't cheap labour. They're people." Inspector dryly, I've had that notion myself from time to time. In fact, I've thought that it would do us a bit of good if sometimes we tried to put ourselves in the place of these young women counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms. Okay, so here Sheila is really the opposite of Burling. Says these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people, and by their referring to them as cheap labour, and this kind of damning accusation of Mr. Birling by the inspector above links to everything that we've just talked about today. And it shows that Sheila is quite the opposite of Mr. Birling, that Sheila can see the is very empathetic, and she can see the suffering that Eva Smith and other women like her have gone through. So she started to think about the wider world now, rather than just the death of Eva Smith, which is what everybody else is thinking about. She's now thinking about the wider issues, and that's when Priestley, characterised by the inspector, starts to talk about this. He starts talking about there are lots of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in this country, Miss Burling. And if there weren't, factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for people. He's talking here about socialism. He's talking about the responsibility that we all have for those that are less fortunate than us. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's quite a bit for today. Next time we're going to be looking at writing about Mr. Burling. So I feel that over the last few weeks we've gone through enough resources to help prepare you. We've gone through some of the quotes and some of the important points that you need to know from Act 1 to get a basic understanding. Please, if you haven't completed the other work, go back and get it done today whilst you're watching this video. And any questions, do let me know.